Hello friends, I am Uniyal, Head Department of Psychology, KTHM College, Nasik. Friends, in the last video we had begun with the perspectives of psychology and we had studied structuralism and functionalism. Today we are going to have a look at Gestalt Psychology, Psychoanalysis and Behaviourism. Gestalt psychology is a school of thought that looks at the human mind and behavior as a whole. Instead, our minds tend to perceive objects as part of a greater whole and as elements of more complex system. Gestalt psychology is based on the observation that we often experience things that are not a part of our simple sensations. Gestalt by definition refers to the form or shape of something and suggests that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. See, this is the philosophy of Gestalt psychology, and I repeat, it is very important for us to understand that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. There is an emphasis on perception in this particular theory of counseling. Gestalt therapies gives attention to how we place meaning and make sense of our world and our experiences. Gestalt psychology, founded by Max Wertheimer, was to some extent a rebellion against the molecularism of Wundt's program for psychology, in sympathy with many others at the time, including William James. In fact, the word Gestalt means a unified or meaningful whole, which was to be the focus of psychological study instead. The original observation was Wertheimer's when he noted that we perceive motion where there is nothing more than a rapid sequence of individual sensory events. In perception, there are many organizing principles called the Gestalt laws. The most general version is called as the law of pregnance. Wolfgang Kohler was born in January 21, 1887 in Reval, Estonia. He received his PhD in 1908 from the University of Berlin. He then became an assistant at the Psychological Institute in Frankfurt, where he met and worked with Max Wertheimer. In 1922, he became the chair and director of the psychology lab at the University of Berlin, where he stayed until 1935. During that time, in 1929, he wrote Gestalt Psychology. Another among them was Kurt Kofka, who was born in March 1886 in Berlin. He received his PhD from the University of Berlin in 1909, and just like Kohler, he became an assistant at Frankfurt. In 1911, he moved to the University of Gießen, where he taught till 1927. While there, he wrote Growth of the Mind, an introduction to child psychology. In 1922, he wrote an article for Psychological Bulletin which introduced the Gestalt program to readers in the US. In 1927, he left for the US to teach at Smith College. He published Principles of Gestalt Psychology in 1935 and he died in 1941. Gestalt psychology is based on the observation that we often experience things that are not a part of our simple sensations. We have already mentioned about the law of pregnance. This law says that we are innately driven to experience things in as a good gestalt as possible. Good can mean many things here, such as regular, orderly, simple, symmetrical, and so on, which then refer to specific Gestalt laws. Now, if you look at this figure A and I show you these different objects, what can you see in this figure? Now, many of you may tell there is an eye, there is a lip, there is an ear, a nose, an eyebrow, and so on. Now, just look at the second figure. Now, if I show you this figure B, most of us can easily recognize that it is a smiley. Now, although the dots over here don't resemble the eye, the nose, which is just a standing line, it's a vertical line, or you have a smile which is a simple curve, but still we perceive this picture as a face or as a smiley. Now in the same figure, there is another face at the extreme right corner which does not have a nose, but still we perceive this as a face. Now this is what I'm trying to tell you, that our mind perceives something and we just don't sum it up as it's a sum of parts, but we on our own give different meaning to that particular picture. Now look at yet another figure. In the figure C, I have drawn the same things but now they are in scattered form. So in the figure C, we will not recognize it as a face because here the relative position of the elements has changed. So the first Gestalt principle were devised in the 1920s by German psychologists Max Wertheimer, Kurt Kofka and Wolfgang Kohler, who aimed to understand how humans typically gain meaningful perceptions from the chaotic stimuli around them. They identified a set of laws which address the natural compulsion to find order in disorder. According to this, the mind informs what the eye sees by perceiving a series of individual elements as a whole. The whole is other than the sum of the parts. The whole is much greater or bigger than the sum of the parts. The next concept in Gestalt psychology is the concept of figure and ground. Gestalt focused on perception and its influence on thinking and problem solving. Perceptions are more than sum of their parts. This is their major principle. Perceptions are active and purposeful, and they spoke about insight learning. Now in the figure and ground concept, which was first understood by Danish phenomenologist Edgar Rubin, the classic example is this one. According to this principle, we tend to segment our visual world into figure and ground. Figure is the object or person that is the focus of the visual field, while the ground is the background. Figure ground organization is a type of perceptual grouping that is a vital necessity for reorganizing objects through vision. In Gestalt psychology, it is known as identifying a figure from the background. For example, black words on a printed paper are seen as a figure and the white sheet as a background. Figure ground perception refers to the tendency of the visual system to simplify a scene into the main object that we are looking at, that is the figure, and everything else that forms the background or the ground. Now let us look at this figure and the things will be more clear. So when you look at the picture carefully, you can see a flask-like thing in between which is in white color. But when you look at the figure more carefully, the black objects look like two faces which are facing each other. So when you look at the white part, that is the flask in the center, at that time the white part becomes your figure, the flask becomes your figure, whereas the black faces, they go in the background, they appear as the background. On the contrary, when you look at the faces, at that time the black part becomes the figure while the white portion goes into the background. The mind organizes the picture's elements automatically to produce the perception that we expect to see. Now look at this picture carefully. Although you can see a picture wherein there are small dots, but if you look at it very carefully, suddenly you form a perception of the dog which is bent downwards and it is facing on the other side. The picture is processed and experienced as a unified whole, and once you perceive a dog, you cannot choose not to see it. So the moment you have seen the dog, the other thing goes in the background and you concentrate looking at that dog. And once you can figure it out, then you just can't help yourselves. You cannot ignore that particular picture. The importance of context is another feature of Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychologists have shown that our perceptions depend not only on our sensory impressions but also on the context of our impressions. You will interpret a man running on the street towards you differently depending on whether you are on a deserted street at night or at a track in the morning. Now, look at this picture carefully. Are the dots in the center of the configuration the same size? So I just want you to concentrate on the red colored dot which is at the center and tell me if they are of the same size. When you have a closer look, you will find out we perceive that in the second part, in the right hand figure, we observe that the red dot seems bigger, whereas in the left part of the picture, the red dot which is at the center, it appears smaller. But to be very true, both the dots are exactly equal in size. If you don't believe me, you can just take a scale and measure it on your screen. Now, why this appears like that? Why do the both dots, although they are of the similar size, why do they appear different? Now, this is because of the context, the other dots that surround this red color dot. In the left side of the picture, the red dot is surrounded by bigger dots and hence the dot appears smaller. Whereas on the righter part of the picture, you have smaller dots surrounding the red dot and hence the red dot appears to be bigger. Let us look at another excellent example where the importance of context is explained in detail. Look at this figure carefully and please read aloud. So in the first row, we read A, B, C, D, right? And in the next row, 12, 13, 14, 15. Good. So you've learnt your numbers and alphabets correctly in the nursery classes, right? But friends, I want you to look at the second element carefully. So in the first row, we read A and then B. But in the second row, we read it as 12 and then 13. Now I want you to look carefully at the second element. So when you look at it, you realize that they both look similar. Now although they both look similar, in the first row, we do not read it as 13 and similarly in the second row, we do not read it as B. Now why does this happen? Have you ever thought how our mind works or how the brain figures out which element of that is 13 and which one is a B? This is just because of the context. So if you have A and C on the sides of that particular element, it is obvious you are going to call it as B. But when you have 12 and 14, you are going to name the same element as 13. However hard you try, you won't call the letter in the first row as 13 and similarly in the second row, you won't call it as B. This is the importance of context. Now this was regarding the dots and the numbers. Now let us have a look at this picture. This is with regards to the color. Now which of the grey squares is brighter? I want you to look at the grey square in the center, compare them and find out which grey square appears brighter. Now I know it is very obvious. Most of you will answer that the first grey square which is on the left side is brighter as compared to the grey square on the right side. Now this happens because, let me tell you that both the grey shades are exactly the same. You can use a shade card, you can use a masking window and you can compare both the grey colors. They are exactly the same. But the difference is seen just because of the context. So if the gray on the left side is surrounded by a black color and due to contrast it appears brighter. Whereas on the right side you have a brighter shade of white. You have a white on the surrounding of the grey square and hence that particular grey square appears darker. So this is the effect of the contrast or it is because of the context. Now this is a very famous example when in English there is a saying that man is known by the company he keeps. So this Gestalt principle works there too. I mean if you are surrounded by studious people, people may perceive you also as a studious person. Similarly, if you mingle and move around with mischievous students, many a times the teacher perceives you also as a mischievous student. So friends, next time be careful of the context you are in. So friends, till now we have studied the different perspectives of psychology. We began with the structuralism of Wilhelm Wundt, the functionalism of William James, and then we studied Gestalt psychologist. I wish to tell you that many of the students are under the impression that Gestalt is the name of a psychologist. But friends, it is not the name of one psychologist, but basically we have Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Kohler, and Kurt Kofka, who three together form the group of Gestalt psychologists. In the next videos, we will be studying something more about psychoanalysis and behaviorism in detail. Friends, thanks a lot for watching this video, and I request you to go through all the videos, take down your notes and also follow the assignments that will be given on our Google Classroom. Thanks a lot.